In California, a fish that most anglers dismiss as a largemouth's lesser cousin now holds a world record over 11 pounds, heavier than any spotted bass has a right to be. In the spring-fed rivers of central Texas, there's a bass so rare that a group of third graders had to lobby the state legislature to save it from extinction. In southern Georgia, a bass carries a turquoise blue belly so vivid it looks painted, and most fishermen who live within an hour of its habitat have never laid eyes on one. And in a Yale University lab in 2022, a team of geneticists proved that America's most iconic freshwater fish, the largemouth bass, may not be the species anyone thought it was. Most anglers grow up believing there are 2, maybe 3 species of bass in America. The truth is far stranger. From the limestone streams of the Texas Hill Country to the tannic rivers of the Florida Panhandle, the black bass genus holds a diversity that the fishing world is only beginning to understand. These are 9 bass species that most American anglers have never heard of, and each one rewrites a small piece of what we think we know about bass fishing. The last one on this list might change the way the fishing world thinks about its most famous fish forever. Number 9. Spotted bass, Micropterus punctulatus. Ask most anglers what they just caught, and if it wasn't a largemouth, they'll call it a spotted bass. They're usually wrong, and they're usually confused. The spotted bass is one of the most misidentified fish in American freshwater, and its story is far more interesting than its reputation suggests. The spotted bass was not formally recognized as distinct from the smallmouth bass until 1927. For more than a century of American fishing, it simply didn't exist in the scientific record, even though it was being caught across the South and Midwest from Virginia to Texas. Its range covers a wide arc of the eastern United States, primarily in river systems draining into the Gulf of Mexico and the Ohio River Basin. It prefers deeper pools and slower current than its smallmouth cousin, and it often shares habitat with largemouth bass, which is precisely why anglers confuse the two. But the spotted bass has a trait the largemouth doesn't: a small, rough patch of teeth on its tongue. That detail, barely noticeable unless you know to look, is one of the quickest ways to tell them apart. The jaw doesn't extend past the eye, the lateral markings form a more distinct row of blotches, and the body is slightly narrower. It's a different fish. It just never got the credit. Then came California. In the 1970s and 1980s, spotted bass, or more specifically, the closely related Alabama bass, were introduced into reservoirs in the Sierra Nevada foothills. In these deep, cold, shad-rich impoundments, the fish thrived beyond anything biologists predicted. By the 2010s, California was producing spotted bass over 10 pounds. In 2023, Nick Dulek pulled an 11-pound, 4-ounce specimen from New Bullets Bar Reservoir, a fish that rewrote the IGFA all-tackle world record and put a species most anglers barely think about into the record books. For anglers, the spotted bass fights harder for its size than a largemouth. It dives deep, pulls relentlessly, and doesn't jump as often, a slugger, not a showman. On light tackle in a river setting, a 3-pound spotted bass will test your drag. The spotted bass lived in the largemouth shadow for a century. California just proved it was paying attention. Number 8. Neosho bass, Micropterus velox. In the gravel-bottomed streams of the Ozark Plateau, a bass lives that most ichthyologists didn't know was its own species until the 21st century. The Neosho bass looks like a smallmouth. It fights like a smallmouth. It lives alongside smallmouth. But genetically, it is something else entirely. The Neosho bass is native to a small cluster of river systems in southwestern Missouri and northwestern Arkansas, the Illinois River, the Elk River, and tributaries of the Neosho River that give the species its name. Its range is tiny. The streams it calls home are clear, cool, and fast, classic Ozark water running over chert gravel and limestone ledges. For decades, fisheries biologists treated these fish as ordinary smallmouth bass and managed them accordingly. That decision nearly wiped the species out before anyone knew it existed. In the 1950s and 1960s, state wildlife agencies stocked hatchery-raised smallmouth bass into many of these same Ozark streams. The intent was to boost recreational fishing. The effect was genetic contamination. Smallmouth and Neosho bass hybridized freely, and in many tributaries, the purebred Neosho populations began to disappear. It wasn't until researchers applied modern genomic analysis that the full picture emerged. The Neosho bass, formerly described as Micropterus velox in 2023, was a distinct evolutionary lineage, one that had been quietly eroding for decades. Today, only a handful of stream reaches in the Ozarks still hold genetically pure Neosho bass populations. The Elk River in southwestern Missouri and portions of the Illinois River drainage in Arkansas are among the last strongholds. Conservation researchers are now mapping the genetic purity of Neosho bass across their remaining range, but the irony is painful. The very agencies tasked with protecting native fish were the ones who endangered this species, simply because no one realized it was there. The Neosho bass is slightly smaller than a typical smallmouth, averaging 10 to 14 inches, with a bronze-green body and faint vertical barring. On the end of a line, it fights the way all Ozark stream fish do, darting between rocks, using the current, punching above its weight in water that rarely exceeds knee depth. Ultralight spinning gear and small crankbaits are the standard approach for anglers who wade these streams. For those who fish the Ozarks, there's something humbling about casting into a clear gravel run and knowing the fish on the end of the line might be one of the last pure Neosho bass on Earth. It looks like a smallmouth. It fights like a smallmouth. But it carries a genetic signature millions of years in the making, one that a few decades of careless stocking almost erased. Number 7. Redeye bass, Micropterus cusi. The name gives it away. Look at this fish in clear water, and the first thing that registers is the eyes. Crimson red, startlingly bright, like something that belongs in a tropical reef, not an Appalachian creek. The red-eyed bass is a creature of small waters. It lives in the cool, clear streams of the southern Appalachians, from northern Alabama and Georgia into the Carolinas and eastern Tennessee. These are not baseboat waters. These are creeks, tight, canopied, shaded by rhododendron and hemlock, running cold even in July. The red-eyed bass is rarely longer than 12 inches and seldom weighs more than 2 pounds. The world record redeye, caught in Alabama in 1995, weighed just 8 pounds, 5 ounces, a giant by the standards of this species, but a fish most largemouth anglers would barely photograph. What the redeye lacks in size, it compensates for with aggression. It strikes topwater flies and small poppers with an intensity that belies its dimensions. Creek anglers, a dedicated subculture who wade shallow water with ultralight rods and 4-pound test, consider the redeye bass one of the purest fishing experiences in the American Southeast. No electronics, no trolling motors, no tournaments. Just you, a creek, and a fish with red eyes that hits like it has something to prove. The redeye's taxonomy has grown more complex in recent years. Genetic research has revealed that what was once called a single species, Micropterus cusi, may actually encompass several distinct lineages scattered across different river drainages. The Coosa bass, the Cahaba bass, the Warrior bass, the Bartram's bass, these names are emerging as scientists untangle the redeye complex, and each one may represent a species found in only a few river systems. The redeye bass isn't one story. It may be 5 or 6, each waiting to be fully told. For a generation of Southern Creek anglers, the redeye has always been the fish that made small water feel like an adventure. Science is only now catching up to what those anglers already knew. There's more going on in these creeks than meets the eye. Number 6. White bass Maroon chrysops. This one breaks the rules. The white bass isn't a black bass at all. It belongs to the temperate bass family Maroon, the same lineage as the striped bass and the yellow bass. But it carries the name, it shares the water, and for millions of American anglers, it's the first bass they ever caught. The white bass deserves its place on this list precisely because most people don't realize what it actually is. White bass are schooling fish. They roam reservoirs and large rivers across the central United States in packs that can number in the thousands. When a school pushes shad to the surface, an event anglers call a boil, the water erupts. Birds circle overhead. Every cast draws a strike. A single angler can catch 50 fish in an hour. It's the kind of action that converts non-anglers into lifers. The white bass's native range stretches from the Great Lakes through the Mississippi River Basin and into the Gulf Coast drainages. It has been stocked far beyond that range and now occupies reservoirs in most of the lower 48 states. The species averages 1 to 3 pounds, with exceptional fish reaching 5. The all-tackle world record stands at 6 pounds, 13 ounces, caught in Lake Orange, Virginia, in 1989. It's not a trophy species. It's a volume species, and that's part of its charm. Every spring, white bass make spawning runs up tributary rivers and creeks, crowding into shallow riffles and densities that can seem impossible. These runs are local events in the Midwest and South. Families line riverbanks, kids cast worms into the current, and coolers fill with fish. In states like Oklahoma, Kansas, and Arkansas, the white bass run is as much a seasonal tradition as deer season. For anglers chasing trophy largemouth or finicky trout, the white bass might seem beneath notice. But underestimate it at your own risk. This fish turns more beginners into anglers than any species in America, and it does it by being exactly what fishing should feel like: fast, fun, and completely unpredictable. Number 5. Alabama bass, Micropterus hinchalli. For most of its existence, this fish didn't have its own name. It was classified as a subspecies of the spotted bass, Micropterus punctulatus hinchalli, a footnote in the taxonomy, not a headline. Then, in 2008, a team of researchers at Auburn University examined its morphology and genetics closely enough to conclude that it wasn't a subspecies at all. It was its own species, the Alabama bass. The Alabama bass is native to the Mobile River Basin, a drainage system covering portions of Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and the Florida Panhandle. In its home waters, it occupies the ecological niche between largemouth and spotted bass, favoring pools and runs in medium-sized rivers, aggressive, adaptable, and fast-growing. None of that would be controversial if the Alabama bass had stayed where it belongs. It didn't. Through intentional stocking and illegal introductions, anglers moving fish between waterways, sometimes deliberately, sometimes as bait bucket contamination, the Alabama bass has spread across the southeastern United States. It now occupies reservoirs in the Carolinas, Virginia, Tennessee, Georgia, and even California. And wherever it arrives, it does two things. It outcompetes native bass species for food and habitat, and it hybridizes with them, diluting their genetic integrity. In South Carolina's Lake Kiowa, the introduction of Alabama bass led to the near-complete genetic swamping of the native redeye bass population within 2 decades. In North Carolina's mountain reservoirs, Alabama bass are advancing upstream into smallmouth bass territory. The invasions often follow a pattern. Alabama bass establish themselves in impoundments, then move into tributaries, hybridizing with whatever native Micropterus species occupies those streams. In some cases, the genetic takeover happens within 10 years of the Alabama bass's arrival. The species' ability to thrive in impoundments gives it an edge that most native river-adapted bass simply cannot match. For anglers, the Alabama bass is a paradox. It's a great game fish, strong, abundant, cooperative on the end of a line. But its presence in non-native waters represents one of the most serious conservation threats facing American black bass diversity today. Catching one is easy. Undoing the damage may be impossible. The Alabama bass didn't ask to be moved. But now that it has been, the consequences are spreading faster than any management plan can contain. Number 4. Guadalupe bass, Micropterus treculii. A French botanist named Auguste Trécul first collected this fish from a Texas river in 1849. It took nearly a century for American scientists to formally recognize it as its own species in 1942. And it took a group of third graders in Decatur, Texas, to convince the state legislature to name it the official state fish in 1989. A move that may have saved it from disappearing entirely. The Guadalupe bass is the only black bass species whose native range falls entirely within a single state. It lives in the clear, spring-fed streams of the Edwards Plateau, the Guadalupe River, the Llano, the Upper Colorado, portions of the San Marcos and San Antonio drainages. These are limestone-bottom rivers fed by the same aquifer system that sustains some of the most biologically unique water in North America. The fish is small. The state record is just 3.71 pounds, caught from the Colorado River in 2014, but it has adapted to swift current in ways that make every encounter feel larger than the number on the scale. The Guadalupe bass nearly vanished because of a well-intentioned mistake. Between 1974 and 1980, the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department stocked nearly 7 million non-native smallmouth bass into Edwards Plateau rivers. The smallmouth hybridized freely with the Guadalupe bass. Within a generation, purebred Guadalupe populations were collapsing. In some rivers, more than half the bass carried hybrid genetics. The recovery effort has been one of the most ambitious native fish restoration programs in American history. TPWD identified a pure genetic strain on the upper Nueces River, bred them in captivity, and over the past 3 decades has reintroduced more than 2.4 million purebred Guadalupe bass fingerlings into hill country rivers while removing smallmouth from the same waters. The results have been promising. Genetic purity in key watersheds is climbing back toward pre-introduction levels. Fly fishermen call the Guadalupe bass the Texas trout. A fish that holds behind boulders in fast current, rises to topwater patterns, and uses the river's energy to fight beyond its weight class. For Texas anglers, catching a purebred Guadalupe in its home water is more than recreation. It's a statement that the river still works. The smallest black bass in North America, the only one with a state to call its own. And it nearly disappeared before anyone thought to protect it. Number 3. Suwannee bass, Micropterus noxious. Most bass are some shade of green. This one turns blue. During breeding season, adult males develop a turquoise so bright across their cheeks, bellies, and breasts that the fish looks hand-painted, a color that has no equivalent in any other black bass species in North America. The Suwannee bass exists in 2 river systems. That's it. The Suwannee River drainage and the Ochlockonee River drainage, both flowing through northern Florida and a sliver of southern Georgia. It was formally described in 1949 by ichthyologists Bailey and Hubbs, making it one of the earliest black bass species recognized as distinct, and yet it remains one of the least known to the broader fishing world. Its total geographic range is smaller than some Florida counties. This is not a large fish. The Suwannee base seldom exceeds 12 inches and rarely weighs more than a pound. The all-tackle world record is 3 pounds, 14 ounces, caught in Florida in 1985. Females can live up to 12 years, though males rarely make it past 9. It feeds on crayfish, aquatic insects, and small fish, preferring the fast-moving water over rocky shoals and limestone outcrops, habitat that links it ecologically to its cousins the shoal bass and redeye bass rather than to the largemouth that dominates Florida's lakes. The Suwannee River itself is one of Florida's most distinctive waterways, a tannic, spring-fed river running through cypress forests and limestone karst, its water stained dark by decaying vegetation, but often startlingly clear near its many springs. The Ichitocme and Santa Fe rivers, both tributaries of the Suwannee, also hold populations. These are quiet, unhurried waters, a world apart from the tournament-heavy bass lakes that define Florida's fishing reputation. Most anglers who visit Florida chase largemouth in famous lakes, Okeechobee, Toho, Kissimmee. They never think to wade a spring-fed river in the northern part of the state. And that's exactly why a bass with a blue belly can hide in plain sight, less than a day's drive from millions of people. It's the bass that proves you don't need size to be unforgettable. You just need color. Number 2. Shoal bass, Micropterus cataracti. For most of its history, this fish didn't have a name. Anglers in Georgia and Florida called it a redeye bass. Biologists assumed it was an undescribed subspecies, something close to the redeye, maybe a regional variant, not significant enough to warrant its own classification. That assumption held for decades, until 1999, when ichthyologists James Williams and George Burgess published a formal description of a new species, Micropterus cataracti, the shoal bass. The species is native to a single river basin, the Apalachicola-Chattahoochee Flint system of Georgia, Alabama, and the Florida Panhandle. This is ancient water. The Chattahoochee and Flint rivers have been flowing in roughly their current courses for millions of years, and the shoal bass evolved to exploit a habitat that few other bass species occupy: fast-moving, rocky shoals where whitewater pours over bedrock and boulder fields. The fish's body is built for current, slightly compressed, muscular, with a large caudal spot and tiger-like vertical bars that camouflage it against sunlit rocks. The shoal bass can reach 24 inches and weigh upward of 8 pounds, making it a legitimate game fish by any standard. But its populations have been devastated. Dam construction on the Chattahoochee River destroyed miles of shoal habitat, converting free-flowing rapids into slack impoundments. The species has been functionally extirpated from several reaches of its native range. Introduced Alabama bass and spotted bass have compounded the problem through competition and hybridization. In Alabama, the shoal bass has been declared endangered, and harvest is prohibited statewide. The strongest remaining populations persist in the Flint River system of central Georgia, one of the longest free-flowing rivers in the eastern United States. Here, anglers who know where to look can still find shoal bass holding in the rapids, ambushing crayfish in the current breaks, and fighting with a power that surprises anyone expecting a fish this obscure to be tame. The shoal bass waited millions of years without a name. It got one just in time to need protection. Whether that protection comes fast enough is a question the next 2 decades will answer. Number 1. Florida bass, Micropterus sammuth/M. floridanus. This is the fish that changes everything. Not because it's rare. Not because it's endangered. But because it rewrites the identity of the most famous freshwater fish in American history. For generations, anglers, biologists, and wildlife agencies treated the giant bass of Florida as a subspecies of the largemouth, Micropterus sammuts floridanus. The Florida strain largemouth, they called it. A bigger, faster-growing version of the same fish, stocked into reservoirs across the southern United States to boost trophy potential. It was the engine behind Texas's share lunker program, behind California's trophy base boom, behind decades of hatchery management decisions from Georgia to Arizona. Everyone agreed on the basic premise. The Florida fish and the northern largemouth were the same species, with regional variation. In 2022, a team of researchers led by Yale's Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology published a genomic analysis that appended 75 years of classification. Using DNA samples from 394 specimens across all known black bass species, they proved that the Florida bass is not a subspecies. It is a fully separate species, as genetically distinct from the largemouth bass as the smallmouth is. The study, published in Scientific Reports, concluded something even more startling. The scientific name Micropterus sammuts, which had been applied to the largemouth bass since the mid-20th century, actually belongs to the Florida bass. The type specimen described by Lassapede in 1802 near Charleston, South Carolina, falls within the range and genetics of what we now call the Florida bass. The real, largemouth bass, the northern fish, should be Micropterus nigricans, a name pulled from synonymy after more than a century of disuse. The implications ripple across the entire fishing world. Every state that stocked Florida strain largemouth into its waters was introducing a separate species. Every hybridization event between Florida bass and northern largemouth was interspecific, not merely a mixing of strains. Trophy records, stocking strategies, and conservation plans built on the assumption that these were one species now rest on a foundation that science has pulled away. George Perry's 1932 world record bass from Montgomery Lake, Georgia, 22 pounds, 4 ounces, the most famous fish ever caught in freshwater, may have been a Florida bass, not a largemouth. The distinction didn't exist when he pulled it from that flooded oxbow. It exists now. For anglers, the Florida bass feels no different on the end of a line. It still grows enormous, still ambushes from structure, still generates the explosive topwater strikes that made bass fishing America's most popular freshwater pursuit. But its identity has changed. The most iconic fish in American fishing has a new name, and the old name never belonged to the fish we thought it did. That's the kind of discovery that doesn't just add a species to a list. It rearranges the list itself. 9 species. 9 stories hidden inside a single word that most anglers think they understand. But bass, in America, is not one fish. It's a web of evolutionary history, geographic isolation, human error, and ongoing discovery that stretches from the Ozarks to the Edwards Plateau to the Tannic rivers of the Florida Panhandle. The deeper you look into American waters, the more you realize how much is still being found. If this video showed you something new about the fish beneath the surface, subscribe to American Fishing Atlas. There's always another species, another river, another story waiting.